time of year to talk. Thank you everyone for coming out in what we know is a very busy time of year to talk about what isn't always the most exciting topic, but a very important one, which is the update of the City of Atlanta zoning ordinance. My name, for those of you who have not been to previous meetings, is Caleb Rossico. I am project manager for the consulting team leading this effort. We are a company called TSW, have been working on planning in the City of Atlanta for almost 3 decades now, and this is a true personal privilege. Before I introduce our other team members, I would like to acknowledge that we do have an elected official here this evening. Councilwoman Mary Norwood is in the room, and if we have any other elected officials online, I'd like to also thank you very much for joining us as well. And so what we wanted to do this evening is to update everyone on what we're calling Module 2 of the proposed zoning ordinance update. This is the part of the code that focuses on really the less glamorous but very foundational aspects of our zoning code. Things like how do we interpret certain words, things like how do we measure certain things. And so what we wanted to do this evening is to give everyone an overview of the kind of regulations that are going to be in the document before you this evening. We are not going to cover everything because, quite frankly, this is a several 100-page module. And so we want to just orient you, give you time to go home, review it on your own time over the holidays. And then early next year, we're going to have another meeting to answer any questions that you may have. And so our schedule this evening is to brief everyone on what work has been accomplished since our last meeting, to go through some of the rules of interpretations, some of the development standards, have a very brief Q&A focused on really the process, and then talk a little bit about next steps. And now that we have everyone fully in the room, I would also like to use this as an opportunity to acknowledge our collaborators who have been very important to this effort. Obviously, Director Kieta Holmes with the Office of Zoning and Development is the manager of this effort for the City of Atlanta, has been working very closely with us to get us to the point where we are today. And then we have several other consultant team members. We have Christy Dobson with Code Studio, who's been doing a lot of the writing and graphic production. We have Nathan Brown with TSW, who's been helping with some of the coding provisions. Tia Maxwell Farmer, also with TSW. And certainly last but not least, the entire team from Content Consulting Group, who's been sending out the emails that you've received, setting up the meetings tonight, and very importantly, taking care of the AV, which I'm completely clueless about. So that's Andrea, that is Yinka Online, Content Online, and several others. So let's get started. If I can figure out how to advance. Okay, it's not working. Here we go. So progress update. So the other thing I wanted to mention to everyone, and I've said this at the beginning of every meeting, is that we are updating the zoning code at the same time that the City of Atlanta is working on the comprehensive plan. And this is a truly unprecedented opportunity in the history of Atlanta to align our vision for the city, our plan for the city, which is the comprehensive plan, with the regulations that implement that plan. So we do have a table out front for Plan A. We have Nate Holtzel with Plan A, who can certainly share more information with that. And just wanted to, again, mention that that particular effort is going on and that we've been working very closely with that team to do a couple of things. The first thing is make sure that anything coming out of the Plan A process aligns with what we're doing here. So you may have noticed if you've gone to the Plan A meetings, they've created some new character area types or some new development pattern types, and we've created some new zoning districts that could implement those. But more importantly, we've also been sharing a lot of information. In the public's eye, the difference between zoning and planning is sometimes confusing. And so when you share comments with us about something that may be more applicable to the comp plan, we share it with that team and vice versa. And in terms of process, the Plan A process is currently underway with some efforts. They have a series of community meetings that have occurred. And the zoning process, again, is very similar to that. Our goal is to have a draft zoning code for everyone to review by late spring, early summer of next year so that we can begin the official adoption process, which very closely aligns with the adoption process of the comprehensive plan. So now for the purpose of the meeting this evening. So the zoning ordinance, as I mentioned briefly before, is being released in 3 what we're calling modules. These are basically similar types of zoning regulations. They are being released for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it's really difficult for any community to digest a document that is several hundred pages. So we felt very strongly when we took this commission that releasing it into a series of bite-sized pieces or somewhat bite-sized pieces would be a better opportunity for the public to really digest and understand the regulations. The other thing we're doing with the module approach, which I think is incredibly important, is that everyone is a draft. Every single zoning recommendation we talk about this evening or at the next meeting is a draft until that final draft is produced for voting on by City Council. And the reason we're doing it that way is we know that elements of the code that may be a later module could influence how communities respond to something that is an earlier module. So what we've been doing is we've been putting forth our best guess, if you will, as a starting point for discussion and have a process to continually refine that. So for example, if there is something in module 2 tonight that is foundational to whether a zoning district is appropriate in your mind, you'll be able to share comments with us. We have a wonderful website set up, which can be accessed in the room out in front or via the project website. And we'll, for those of you who are here via Zoom, we'll send the links at the end of the meeting. So again, we're going to use that feedback to get a draft that we feel comfortable with, that we feel that is something that I and my team as consultants to the City of Atlanta can confidently feel reflects the needs and aspirations of the residents, businesses, and property owners of the city, and has been very well vetted before we turn it over to the City of Atlanta to begin consideration of the adoption process. And so we are on the second module meeting. For those of you who did attend the module 1 meeting, you may recall that that meeting focused on really what are the foundational zoning districts. We talked about this idea of taking current zoning districts, breaking them into a series of regulations that regulate the form, meaning what the development looks like, how big it is, how much portion of the lot it covers, from the use of the property. And by putting those two things together, we create our zoning districts. We received a lot of comments on that. We have a several page series of amendments that we've made based on those comments on the project website. And so we're going to be doing a similar process with module 2. Now tonight, we get a little bit more into the weeds. Module 1 was just about zoning districts. Tonight, though, we have a lot of very important supplemental information to talk about. One of those things is going to be how do we interpret the zoning ordinance? So a lot of you who had read module 1 asked us, how do you calculate building height? How do you calculate setbacks? How do you calculate lot coverage? And the draft we've unveiled tonight is going to answer those questions. We're also going to talk about a lot of those other sort of site issues that are in the zoning code today that really apply citywide. Things like parking, things like fences, transitions, landscaping, lighting, and others. We're going to follow this with a Q&A session on January 13th, where we're going to bring everyone back together via Zoom to answer any questions that you may have. And for those of you who are already sort of formulating questions this evening, when we get to the final slide, we'll have an opportunity for you to submit those in writing through the project website so that we can pre-answer some of them. After that, we get to module 3, which relates to the administration of the zoning code. This is where we're going to talk about the processes to get certain types of permits in the city, go through variances, and handle what are called nonconformities, which are really buildings or uses or structures that don't currently or will in the future do not meet the requirements of the zoning code. And of course, talk about the enforcement process. And so that'll be February 3rd, followed by a Q&A on March 17th. And I again wanted to remind everyone that even though we are focused on Module 2 this evening, you are encouraged to use our website and submit your comments and questions on any module to date until the end of March. So even though we're talking about Module 2, if you have a comment about Module 1, by all means, please let us know. We plan on updating these documents continuously based on your feedback. And then finally, there were a couple of things that I do know are very important to residents of Atlanta that I wanted to mention because they're not in the zoning code today. One is tree protection, although we are working very closely with the Department of City Planning on the forthcoming potential amendments to the tree protection ordinance. We also don't regulate stormwater, although we have made some provisions in here to encourage innovative green stormwater management. We don't regulate soil erosion or sedimentation. These are all state ordinances that come down that the city of Atlanta adopts, nor flood protection. And then finally, we don't regulate noise. So there are going to be a series of other things that are not in zoning, but if we hear, for example, that one of those needs to be tweaked, we're going to give that material to the city of Atlanta. And I'll actually touch on one of those that we already know today. And then finally, zoning has no relationship to the building codes, which again, come down nationally and then are adopted by the state and finally adopted and modified by the city and the city housing code. And then last, but certainly not least, I wanted to remind everyone, as I have at every meeting, that our recommended approach to the city is to use this zoning ordinance rewrite process to focus on getting the regulations correct and regulation that can implement the comprehensive plan now and over the next 20, 30, 40 years. But what we are not doing is we have recommended to the city to not proactively rezone properties as part of this process. So if you are R1 today, you will be R4 equivalent once the code is adopted. If you are SPI 21 subarea 3 today, you will be the equivalent to that when it's adopted. But we do feel very strongly that the ability of the city to conduct the comprehensive plan, to conduct ongoing planning as Atlanta has done for 20 to 30 to 40 years, is going to be a great opportunity to actually implement this ordinance. So with that said, let's talk about Module 2. So the first part is the rules of interpretation. This is essentially the part of the zoning ordinance that Director Holmes and her staff and people who are building in the city use to understand what the terms in the zoning ordinance actually mean. And it falls into really two types of, two chapters in this draft ordinance. The first chapter is chapter 3, which are really the rules for the form districts, which we'll talk about in a moment. And the second part is chapter 10. And the reason that we had to break those apart, not to get too into the weeds, but the reason we had to break those apart is that we have historic districts in the city of Atlanta that are not going to be changed as part of this zoning rewrite, but they do use terminology in the zoning code. So we have to make sure that those parts of the code are organized in such a way that if a word is used in a historic district, it can naturally flow into that district. But about 95% of what I'm going to talk about tonight and 95% of what you're going to see related to these two chapters is pretty much cleanup or clarification. We hope that when you look at it, you'll find the writing to be much more user-friendly. Christy and her team have done a fantastic job at getting rid of as much of the legalese as possible and making it easy for non-professionals to interpret. And then they've also provided some really wonderful, wonderful graphics. So how does this all work? So what you see before you today is a representative zoning district, form district. This happens to be N2A, which I believe is sort of equivalent to, is this an R4B? R4A district today. When you look at that 2-page zoning district, again, we've gone down to 2 pages in a chart format with graphics. But when you look at it, there's a table at the bottom that has a lot of different terms. So you see lot size, density, coverage, streetscape, massing, ground story, et cetera, et cetera. These are all terms of art. They are currently terms of art today, and they are going to be terms of art tomorrow. And each of those has a whole series of ideas behind it that are important to allow the Department of City Planning to adequately implement it. So what we have done is we have taken every one of those terms and we have given it its own division. And for those of you who have ever looked at the zoning code today, you will know that finding out what something means is really hard. It may be in the definition section, but then there's a supplemental regulation somewhere else, and then there's a different meaning in the zoning districts. What we have done is we have scoured the entire zoning code and we have organized all of those definitions in a single 1, 2, or 3-page spread. That includes a couple of things. The first that it includes is a very brief definition of what it means. So for example, active depth. This is the requirement that many zoning districts are going to have active uses at the ground floor, things like housing or offices or retail, but not storage rooms or data centers or that sort of thing. So there's a definition. There is an intent. The intent provision is really important as for when the city interprets the zoning to make sure that they have a clear understanding of the intent. But it's also incredibly important if a developer or someone tries to sue the city. This becomes one of the legal foundations for defending the decision that the Office of Zoning and Development makes in interpreting the code. So every single division has an intent statement provided. You then get into the applicability, and this gets a little bit more complicated. This begins to talk about where these may apply in what districts, or if it's the case of active depth, which stories of the building it does or does not apply. And then very importantly, exemptions. So for example, active depth is primarily intended for larger commercial and mixed use and multifamily buildings. So when you read it at the bottom, you'll notice that it doesn't apply to lots with one dwelling unit. So basically none of this applies to single unit houses. It's really for the larger, more intense development types. And then you get into the standards. These are the particular nuances of what it means, how high it is, how it's measured. If there's any sort of nuances that the department needs to know to determine whether it is being interpreted correctly. There's then a very important section that talks about how it's measured. So again, for those of you who have looked at the code today, I think there may be 10 images in the entire zoning ordinance today, and there will be several hundred when it's adopted. So it tells how you measure depth, how you, for example, measure ceiling height, and uses graphics as much as possible. And then finally, see, it just did something again. Finally, it has provisions for relief. And this is really important when we talk about zoning regulations that apply in the more intense parts of the city of Atlanta today. For those of you who have ever followed zoning entitlements in perhaps the major corridors like Piedmont Road Corridor, Roswell Road Corridor, Ponce de Leon Avenue, or Metropolitan Parkway, you'll know that a lot of those are zoned in such a way that they give the administrator a lot of authority to waive requirements. And sometimes those are not as clear as they should be. So what we have done here is we have proactively defined the legal authority citywide of the zoning administrator to waive the zoning requirements. And anything above that has to go to BZA. So this is a fairly big change from today, where Director Holmes has a lot of power, whether she likes it or not. This is to give some barriers to what we feel, based on talking to the community and talking to others, are appropriate guardrails. But if it gets too much, if an applicant comes in and says, I don't want to meet this requirement at all, Director Holmes can say, okay, go to the Board of Appeals. So big change, but we feel that because we've cleaned up the code a lot, we've provided a lot of alternative standards in some cases. This is going to be really helpful to ensure that our codes are followed. So the other thing that we've done is for that 5% of these chapters that is new, we've made some updates to really improve outcomes. And those are generally speaking in 3 areas. I want to talk about streetscapes this evening. I want to talk about the idea of storefront streets this evening, and I want to talk about transition. So streetscape standards are currently found sort of independently in every single zoning district in the city of Atlanta today. So you may have one way of describing a streetscape in Midtown, you may have another way of describing it in West End, you may have another way of describing it in Buckhead Village, and another way in a certain other zoning district. We have consolidated the language so that they all use the same terms. We have carried over the requirement that all developments, when they occur, they must upgrade the sidewalks and the streetscapes to the city standards. And in a couple of cases, pardon me, we've consolidated the widths. We had many zoning districts where, you know, they were written 20 years ago when the ideal street tree zone was 4 feet, but today we know that 5 feet is really better for a tree to get. So we've consolidated a couple of the widths citywide. But what gets really exciting, and I'm a zoning wonk, so you'll have to forgive me for this part. In my opinion, one of the biggest flaws with the zoning code as it is today is that you can have a single roadway. I'll pick on Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard because I live off it. Depending on the zoning district it is in, one property can have one sidewalk requirement today, and the property right next door can have a completely different sidewalk requirement. We have recommended as part of this approach to decouple the sidewalk requirements from the zoning districts with some caveats that I'll talk about. So there is a map that has been produced that contains every street in the city of Atlanta, what street type it is, and there is an associated sidewalk standard with that. So generally speaking, we have a lot of variability in the sort of further out parts of the city, like where we are today, versus sort of the downtown, midtown, Buckhead, West End neighborhoods. These are where we are carrying forward this idea of variable standards. And so what that means is that if I'm on a major corridor, like Howell Mill Road, great example, and my property is zoned a single family district today, I'm going to have a single family width sidewalk, identical to what we have today. But if a property owner comes and is successfully able to rezone that property to higher density, there will be a wider sidewalk associated with it. So this is the exact same thing we have today, no change whatsoever. But there are a couple of locations in the city where we have proactively incorporated specific requirements that are currently in the code. These are what we're calling special streets, and we have A through H. Those just relate to the width of the sidewalk, and these do not vary. So for example, think about Buckhead Village. They have a very particular streetscape that they have worked with developers on to implement. That streetscape has been incorporated verbatim into the map. And you can see when you go out in the room or you look online, they have a very specific purple streetscape that only applies in Buckhead Village. And there are a couple of historic districts, which are actually zoning districts, and because they're sort of hybrid, that also have a very particular streetscape. And so we've also incorporated those forward. So the streetscape approach, again, is to require streetscapes with redevelopment like we do today, to have variable standards in much of the city, but for special locations, historic districts, downtown, midtown, Buckhead, around the Beltline, we're going to predefine what the sidewalk requirement is for those areas. Additionally, just because I know people have questions, I did want to remind everyone that we are carrying forward the requirement for no sidewalks if you are currently zoned R1 through R3. There was a lot of discussion several years ago when the code was amended about requiring that. and that was not put into the code, and so we will not be incorporating that at this time. We are recommending a citywide increase in the required tree zone in the other neighborhoods with sidewalk requirements from 2 to 3 feet. This is based on talking to the arborist and providing adequate room for trees there. And then very importantly, this is super important. All this is super important, but the image before you was Howell Mill Road about 4 or 5 miles south of here where 14th comes in. And they are currently updating the roadway if you've been down there. They're putting in new sidewalks, they're putting in bike facilities. And so we have incorporated a single line into this draft zoning ordinance that requires developers to implement streetscapes in conformance with official city projects. Which means that if the city of Atlanta is about to spend $5 million upgrading the sidewalk, and the developer is going to build a project there 6 months in advance, they have to install that in front of the property. So this one line, we hope, is going to do a couple of things. It's first of all going to make sure that our plans are properly implemented. It will hopefully save city money because developers won't be putting in one thing and then the city rips it out a couple months later and does something else. And we'll definitely have a better outcome. And then we are keeping the requirement that if you're on a bus route and you're a larger development, you do have to make provisions for that as well. So those are streetscapes. The second part of the code that I wanted to draw your attention to is this idea of storefront streets. If you attended any of our meetings last fall, you may remember that we had a series of idea labs and focus workshops where we asked people, what kind of things would you like to see in the zoning ordinance? And one of the comments that we heard a lot from, especially if my memory serves me correctly, a lot of neighborhoods in Southeast Atlanta, a lot of neighborhoods in Southwest Atlanta, was now that we're seeing more and more development in those areas, they wanted to make sure that as big developments come in, that they don't build the projects in such a way that they can never have ground story retail or active uses or neighborhood commercial uses. So what we've incorporated here is an idea that is already in place in Midtown and downtown and parts of Buckhead Village and parts of the Lenox MARTA station area. This idea of what we're calling a storefront street, which is essentially those corridors in the city where we as a community believe that if large buildings come in, be it an office building, an apartment building, a movie theater, that kind of thing, that they have to design that ground story along the sidewalk so that it could one day accommodate retail. We're not requiring retail to go in today, but we're requiring buildings to be laid out so that as buildings change use over time, in 10, 20, 30 years, they can be retrofitted. And the image before you is a wonderful example of this. In the Old Fourth Ward, there is a large apartment building. I think it's called Tribute Lofts at Freedom Parkway and Boulevard. These units, when the building was built, gosh, 20 years ago now, making me feel old, they were residential and they're still residential, but they allow for homeowners to operate offices and uses out of them. So really, really exciting idea. And so we've put this on in the code and we have a map where we're recommending these because again, this is something that a lot of folks asked about. And very importantly, I'm going to go to the map again. We have 3 supplemental maps as part of this module that are going to be critical to the administration of it. The first one is the storefront street map. And so if you're here in person, when you go in the room, the waiting area, or if you're here watching online, you can look on the project website. There is a map that maps these out. And so we've based it on areas that have the requirement today, or areas that have a storefront area today, or just, how the current zoning is. And so they're the major corridors, a lot of them align with major bus routes, a lot of them align with the Beltline. But there are a couple of conditions where we know there is going to be a desire or a need for ground floor storefront uses but we can't actually map them all. And so one example that comes to mind is if you look at Grant Park, there are a couple of they're called neighborhood commercial zones today on Grant Street, I believe. And so we wanted to make sure that if you are building a new project in a existing neighborhood commercial area, like Virginia Highland, North Highland Avenue, the commercial nodes, or like Westview, or like even parts of Garden Hills, there's some commercial areas. That if you're building a commercial building in an area where you already have storefronts, you have to match the storefronts. And so there are the mapped ones, but there are also the ones that are unmapped that relate to existing patterns in our neighborhoods. So the second part of my presentation this evening is focused on the development standards. These are everything else in the zoning ordinance that affects development, but does not relate to the form or the use districts. A lot of this is about how do we lay out a property and how do we lay out the sort of accessory uses on it. So one of the problems today with the zoning code, again, in my opinion, not speaking for the city, is that as an applicant, it's sometimes really difficult to know when the zoning regulations apply, especially the site development standards, if I am not building a completely new building. And so the first thing you will see when you look at this chapter is that we have defined 7 or 8 different kinds of project activities. And these all have a definition associated with them. And there is a single chart that shows which site development standards apply and which don't apply. So this sounds complicated, but it really isn't. So if I'm building a new building, everything applies. You tear it down, you start from scratch. If I am making an addition and it's at the rear of my commercial building and no one sees it, well, only some things apply, right? Not everything. If I am just changing the building facade, other things apply. And so for all of you who have either reviewed applications through MPUs or neighborhoods or on DRCs or through zoning processes, this is going to be incredibly useful in knowing what applies where. Today, it's somewhat vague because it's based on the general citywide nonconformity provisions and the director has to make an administrative interpretation, but this will all be incredibly clear today. So with that said, what are some of the standards? Well, the first thing you'll find when you look at chapter 8 is that we've incorporated the existing block and connectivity standards that are found in many of the zoning districts today. These require larger properties to incorporate new blocks, and they require provisions for connectivity to adjacent parcels within those areas. But there are a couple of changes here. The first one is that today, and I'm happy we're in Buckhead because everyone will know this example. Today, is everyone familiar with Lindbergh Plaza, at least in the room or online? So if you've ever been there, you will notice that there are some driveways through that parking lot that kind of sort of feel like streets, but they're not really streets. Under this new code, there is going to be a requirement that any roadway is required to meet the block size requirement has got to be built to public standards. It has to have sidewalks on both sides. It has to have street trees on both sides. It can't just be a driveway through a parking lot and call it a day. So the idea is to really set up a framework for how developments can change over time and orient. So I'm going to show Edgewood Retail District. I forgot I had this in here. This is down in the Edgewood neighborhood off of Moreland Avenue. This is a development where they sort of tried to lay out those streets and they do have sidewalks on one side, but they're not on both sides. If this were to come in today, or if this were to come in under the new code, those would have to be clearly defined streets. They would have to have trees and sidewalks on both sides. And then very importantly, all the prohibitions in the code about you can't have parking lots along the street, you can't have dumpsters along the street, would also apply to these internal roadways. So big change, but one that is, I think, very important to realizing the vision of the city. The second part of chapter 8 is vehicular parking, which is a big one. Here, when you take a look at it, you'll notice a couple of things. The first thing is we have created a citywide parking standard. And the reason for that is today, if I'm opening a restaurant and I am opening it in Virginia Highland, I may have a different parking requirement than if I am opening it in the Westview Commercial District. And so what we have done in this code is we have come up with a single set of parking ratios that are standardized across the city based on best practices, but we have decoupled parking requirement from the actual zone. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means. Imagine two properties, both on Ponce de Leon Avenue. One of them is zoned C1, which is an older zoning district today. One of them is zoned one of the newer zoning districts. They can be right next door today and have very different parking requirements. Even though they're on the same street, they're in the same part of the city, really doesn't make sense. And so what we have recommended to do is decouple those from zoning and have a citywide standard, which I'll show you in a moment. We've also incorporated the exemption today for buildings built before 1965. For those of you who don't know this, if there was no parking requirement when the building was built, there's no parking requirement today. And have come up with this idea of context-based parking. So what this means is that when you look at the draft, you will see a parking zone map. This map has basically 4 types: PZ1, 2, 3, and 4. These types are a combination of the current parking requirements in those areas with consideration of things like MARTA and the Beltline and the general walkability of the neighborhoods. The first zone that you'll see is the yellow. This is called PZ1 or Parking Zone 1. These are basically the parts of the city today that already do not have any parking requirement whatsoever, either through SPI zoning or because they're within a half-mile walk of a MARTA station. So we've gone in, we've mapped them so that it is incredibly clear. And again, not to keep showing how we're trying to help the Office of Zoning and Development, but today, when an applicant comes in, the director requires them to actually physically go out and measure whether they are within a half-a-mile walk of a MARTA route. This way, the director can just look at the map and say, you're in yellow, you're good. So no need to go out and measure it. Now that said, if the streetcar ever expands or if we get bus rapid transit on Campbellton Road, there will be a way for administrative measurement of that. But that's really, this first zone, Parking Zone 1, is the areas of the city with no requirement whatsoever. The second zone is very similar to that, Parking Zone 2. These are the parts of Atlanta that currently also have no parking requirement, but with a couple of exceptions. The Beltline and the Buckhead parking overlay do have parking requirements for certain alcohol-related uses. And so you may remember that we've changed the terms. We are now defining things like lounge, nightclub, bar, party house in the zoning ordinance. And so this provision, as currently drafted, and again, open for discussion, says that there's no parking requirement except for those things which we believe are a surrogate for the problematic uses today. The third district is a completely new concept. We heard early on, in much the same way that neighborhoods are interested in having major corridors where they want shop fronts, there is also a growing recognition that for a lot of the city, bus transit is really important today and will be really important tomorrow. So what we've done is we've recommended a Parking Zone 3, which has a slightly reduced parking requirement for 5 or 6 corridors in the city that we know, even if MARTA has to cut a lot of service, will always have fairly good MARTA service. We have looked at both current ridership patterns, which we received. We have looked at the proposed MARTA network redesign, and we've identified Roswell Road, Hollowell Parkway, Boone, Cascade Road, Campbellton Road, Metropolitan Parkway, and part of McDonough Boulevard as major areas in the city that will always have some sort of frequent or higher quality bus service. And we've mapped properties within roughly 800 to 1,000 feet, more or less, of those corridors to have a slightly reduced parking requirement. It doesn't go away, but it's reduced a little bit. And then the final zone is everything else. These areas are really remaining the same. They continue to have the current parking requirements, and those are largely our R1 through R3 neighborhoods, a couple of R4 neighborhoods, but not a lot of more intensive parts of the city. A couple other things related to parking that are not about the amount of parking. We have come up with some standards that we have recommended related to the screening of parking lots that may be existing today along major corridors. So you may remember I showed you that diagram of if you do this, then you have to do that. Well, one of the things that if you do this, you have to do that is if you have a current parking lot and you make a substantial modification to it, either you tear it up and put in trees, or you add an addition, or you do this and that, you're going to have to put enhanced screening as currently drafted along the roadway. Atlanta is one of the few jurisdictions in the entire region that allows you to have an unscreened parking lot. And so when you look at the draft code, you'll see that there is a requirement for really an 8-foot landscape zone along parking lots in the city with 6 feet of planting per the arborist, where you have to do trees, you have to do hedges, and you have to do a wall or fence in certain conditions. So this is a modification of a current standard, but not completely new to the city. The other type of parking where we've made a couple of very small but very important changes are bike parking. Several of you told us at our earlier meetings that the fact that the city limits how much parking for bicycles a project has to provide is kind of unusual. It limits it at 50 parking spaces, regardless of where it is today. And so we have actually just recommended removing that cap. So if I am doing a 400 unit apartment building on the Beltline, I'm going to have to provide more parking spaces than if I was doing a 20 unit apartment building along the Beltline. So the cap goes away, but nothing else changes with regard to parking for bicycles. The second part of the code that I know is also really important to folks is this idea of transition. And a lot of you asked during module 1 what exactly the transitions meant. So generally speaking, a transition is the set of requirements that apply when higher intensity development touches lower intensity development. And the image here is along Juniper Street in Midtown. You've got some higher density development on the right in the SPI 16, the Midtown zoning district, and then you've got lower intensity development on the left. So transitions are really about that condition. What we have done as a proposal is we have carried forward all of the existing transition requirements, but we've made a couple of modifications. The first one is that there are some zoning districts that have a transitional requirement of 20 feet of landscaping in a setting where it doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I'm going to pick on my neighborhood again, West End. So imagine there was a lot where it was zone commercial and someone was trying to build a corner store. They would have to put a 20-foot landscape buffer around that corner store today, even if the lot is only 30 to 40 feet deep. The proposed ordinance would not require this in that type of condition because those are what we call neighborhood scale districts, and the design of the development is very compatible. And so this idea of providing types of transitions gets rid of the idea of one transition fits all in the city and applies it to the kinds of locations you're in. So if you look at your map in the draft zoning ordinance, you will see that anytime any more intense development abuts a house scale district, which is really our 1 through R3 today, or R4, R3 today, nothing changes. There's still a 20-foot landscape requirement with screening. But once you get into those parts of the neighborhood, parts of the city that might be a little bit more urban, again, West End, parts of Midtown, parts of Grant Park, there are more options available based on the type of the building and the context. So the first thing you would do as a neighborhood, as a developer, is you would find out what your zoning district is at left. You would find out then what it is adjacent to on right, and then you would go to that type. So in this case, it says type A. You go to type A, you have a diagram. Again, this is identical to the zoning requirements today. There's a 20-foot yard, it has to be landscaped, and there's a 45-degree height plane. But one of the things that we've done is we've also provided additional clarity for areas that are different. So when you look at that transition standard, you'll notice that that condition requires what is called a medium level of screening. That will then take you to the adjacent page, or next couple pages away, and you will see what exactly that means. So it requires trees at a certain density, it requires shrubbery at a certain density, and very importantly, there are now two options for every screening option. Option one is developers can provide a high quality wall that provides opaque screening and do a slightly narrower requirement. But if they're not doing that and they're just doing landscaping, they have to do more. Such that in a lot of cases, there may actually be wider requirements than there are today in certain conditions if a fence or wall is not used. The other type of screening is, as I mentioned before, there are frontage screening requirements. These relate to the screening at the front of the property. We've already talked about aligning the parking lot landscaping with the tree ordinance and increasing the planting zone to 6 feet. Did want to remind everyone that most of the form districts, most of the zoning districts in the city would not allow a parking lot along the street anymore. But again, you might have conditions where you have one, or you might have industrial districts where it makes sense to continue that just because of the manner of operations. We've also incorporated site element screening. Again, this is completely new, but I will tell you, this is something that most cities have in the region and Atlanta doesn't today. Those include new citywide requirements to screen dumpsters to their entire height citywide. Today, screening is only required in certain activity centers and major corridors. This will apply everywhere. Also, loading docks. Again, today, loading docks have to be screened in downtown, midtown, Buckhead, major corridors, Beltline overlay. But if they're going up in a less an area with less zoning regulations today, they don't have to be screened. This would standardize the requirement and say that as a city, we are going to require certain uses and certain provisions to be screened everywhere. So dumpsters, loading docks, mechanical features, and certain uses which are defined in the use chapter. Additionally, there are some updates to the fence and wall standards. We're maintaining most of the current requirements, but the one or two big changes relate to a lot of the neighborhoods. Today, the fence height allowed in different neighborhoods is 42 inches in some areas and 48 in others. So 3.5 or 4 feet. We have recommended standardizing that to 3.5 everywhere, just because it makes it easier to administer, and most of the newer districts have a slightly lower requirement. If you happen to be a corner lot, there would be an allowance for a slightly higher fence if you may be a lot that has, say you have a dog, but you have to set it back further than you do today. So again, this is sort of showing that. The fence standards are very similar to what I showed you before. You would look at your zoning district chart. You would see the permitted fence types in the various locations. And please note, these numbers in the zoning module 1 have not been updated yet. So please bear with us on that. But then you'll see what the requirements are. So there'll be a requirement for height, a requirement for opacity, a requirement for other standards associated with the design. Another very big change is the regulation of retaining walls. So this is a lovely development, and no offense to any of the developers who built this on Hill Street, and I believe the Chosewood Park neighborhood. This becomes completely illegal under the new zoning ordinance. There will be height restrictions to retaining walls along the street. They will have to have terracing if there is existing topography. And we will be removing we have proposed to remove all the retaining wall standards that are currently in chapter 74 of the city code into zoning. So that everything related to retaining walls citywide is in one place. So again, we're trying to ensure, based on the feedback, that if there are legitimate conditions where a retaining wall is necessary, that it has to at least consider its impact on the public realm and impact on the sidewalk. There are a couple of other provisions in here which I would like to verbally state because I'd love folks to provide feedback on. The current draft does talk about the allowed materials for retaining walls. They are stone, brick, stucco, and because it is required in certain historic districts and required in certain other parts of the city, and basically concrete. So a lot of the sort of stacked block retaining walls that you see, I saw one coming up here tonight on Northside Drive at Belmead. All of those stacked walls would not be permitted under the new code because they are not stone or brick. We'd love to hear input on whether we've been too restrictive or whether you all think that is a good idea. We've also created a completely new chapter in the code or division in the code for outdoor lighting. Again, this is one of those things that Atlanta does not have, that I believe every other jurisdiction in the region does today, which is a requirement that citywide, there are some minimum standards for lighting. And so we've taken a pretty light touch here, but what we have recommended is cut off luminaires so the lighting doesn't shine up to make that a citywide standard. And we have recommended requirements that if you have a floodlight, and I live in a neighborhood and deal with this myself, you cannot point a floodlight at the adjacent property, whether you are zoned commercial or whether you are zoned residential, because it is a increasing problem today, and so this would be potentially regulated by that part of the code. So that is a very short, and I know it wasn't short, but very short overview of what you will see if you go and look at the draft module 2 this evening, or really anytime over the next month. Before we talk about next steps, I did want to see if anyone has any questions about process. Again, don't ask about any of the standards because we've got a whole 2 or 3 hours in January to talk about that. But does anyone either online or in the room today have a question related to any of the process or the layout stuff that I've talked about?
Well, one of your first statements was you said 95% of it will be no change in zoning. So does that mean like in this area, the zoning does not allow an ADU over 750 square feet, which includes porch? So that could not be changed unless you get an exemption by your zoning board, or it had to go to city council to change that? How does that work?
So there is a question about change. So the changes, when I meant 95%, a lot of it is, yeah, it's going to be in various provisions. But yes, we are not changing the zoning map in any way, and we are not changing the allowance for accessory dwellings. You may recall that during module 1, we did suggest that there might be parts of the city where 2 would be appropriate. The revised module 1 reduces it back to the current 1. So again, to be very clear, if you are in a part of the city today where you can do 1 ADU, you will be able to do 1 ADU under the new code, and you will not be able to do guest houses.
And you can't go any bigger.
If we have increased the size to 850. Again, that's in module 1. But anything beyond that would be, I guess, a variance, right? Yeah. Not even. Yeah, that's a use change, and BZA can't authorize use changes.
So you cannot go over 850.
Correct. Any other process questions? Because that wasn't process.
I did have a process question, but I want to speak to that also because you've also permitted attached ADUs that are not currently permitted in the new code.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that is in fact a change.
That is a change. And yes, there is a module 1. Again, go to the project website. What we've done for you, make this really easy because we understand that it's a long document. is Christy and I put together a 7 or 8 page summary of every change to module 1 that has been made based on your feedback. And that is in there, Mr. Martin. A lot of different things are in here based on the community feedback. So we're trying to be very transparent, and this is a process question. Any changes we make subsequently to module 1 or subsequently to module 2 are going to be documented in sheets like that, because we know you can't be expected to perfectly memorize 400 pages and what was in that new versions. I wanted to see if we have any comments online before I take any more in the room. Yinka or Christopher, do we have any online questions about process?
We've been addressing process questions in the chat, letting folks know any questions they have about content we're going to be sharing with the reviewing team. One question that came up just a moment ago is, are we planning to publish draft 3 or module 1?
Are we planning to publish draft 3 for module 1? There is only a draft 2 of module 1 at this point. I'm not sure. There is no draft 3, but yes, if we know that you're going to have comments tonight that are going to require Christy and Director Holmes and myself to make updates to module 2. We will publish all of those changes at the same time. So have to bear with us, but we're trying to be incredibly transparent about what changes we make. Every change will have a date associated with it, and there will be a summary sheet. Okay, I have a gentleman in the back.
Module 1 explicitly exempted, did not apply to certain SPIs, like SPI 9, SPI 12. Does module 2 also have similar exemptions?
That's a great question. So again, not to get into the weeds, but there are a couple of parts of the city that are going to keep their current zoning because they are so different from the sort of new format that we've come up with. They are, and please correct me if I've missed any, Greenbrier SPI, which is down on Campbellton Road, Midtown SPI, which is sort of Midtown, Buckhead Village SPI, the Buckhead SPI 12, which is the Lenox MARTA station area, Fort McPherson, and that's it. So in those areas, we are still in the process of reformatting them. Most of them will remain unchanged, but the stuff about, for example, sidewalks, those we have made sure that all of that map that you look at, which took me several weeks of my life to populate, I read through every single SPI and I mapped what the requirements were on those streets today. So if we can take it out of the SPI and move it to the citywide standard, we will. Now, there are things in Midtown today that are going to stay in Midtown that are streetscape related. For example, Midtown has a different tree size than anywhere else in the city, and they're going to keep that under the new code. They have paving requirements that apply only on certain streets in Midtown. That's going to stay there. But we've removed as much as we safely can without compromising the intent of those special districts.
And then the redevelopment proportions, like that has always been a bone of contention for DRC is whether something qualifies for, does it need to be the new standards, is it substantially altering, or is it just simply a minor remodel? That table was very easy to understand. Would that apply within the SPIs that are currently exempted?
We are still in the process of the SPIs. I'm going to ask Christy, what have we?
If it's a zoning requirement, no, but if it's a citywide site.
Okay, so the comment was the question was, if we have a citywide requirement that applies in an SPI, will it be subject to the table? Yes, it will. But if it is a requirement that only exists in that SPI, we're not going to address it. Okay, any other process questions? Yes, ma'am?
I think this is a process question. If it's not, then excuse me, I want to ask it anyway. I live in a historic district. And right now, with the process of development that's happening in that historic district, the aspect of changes come on the back end as opposed to the front end. And so we're wondering if the design team, or whatever they're called, can be up on the upfront part So that when persons go in to try to make changes to their home, that can be done in advance as opposed to after the fact. Is that a process question?
That's not this process, so here's the comment, I'm gonna paraphrase it. Which historic district?
I'll call your.
Collier Heights. Collier Heights is a historic district on the west side of Atlanta. They have been inundated with folks basically doing stuff and not following the rules and asking forgiveness. Is that accurate?
They're very conservative.
Yeah, I'm in West End and it's very similar. The question was, will this zoning 2.0 address the way that the Office of Historic Preservation regulates in historic districts? It will not. We are not changing anything with the historic district standards as part of this rewrite. We can certainly let them know. We do have a coordination meeting with Mr. Adams and Mr. Young in a couple of weeks, and we'll continue to express that concern. Again, personally, I live in West End. It's a similar issue there as well, but we're not changing the enforcement provisions or anything related to the historic districts other than converting them to the new layout.
Okay, then I have then one more, and that is similar, but developers, when they're negotiating with the community, will get a zone change, and then they sell the property and don't necessarily adhere to the original stated thing. So is that a process thing? And is that something?
So the comment for those who are at home was, will there be a way to require developers who negotiate with a community, come up with plans from then selling it to someone else? Again, that's something that we cannot necessarily codify in this process. But let me back up. One of the things that we hope to do as part of this rewrite is we hope that we've identified a lot of the most problematic areas where there are loopholes today, and we hope we've closed them. I would advise any neighborhood negotiating with a developer to always consider that the person who is before you talking will not be the person that implements the project. It's just a really good way to think about it. It's not about the applicant, it's about the property, and use that in your processes. Because I've seen so many properties, oh, we're gonna do the wonderful thing, and then they, move to Chicago and sell it to someone else, so. I do have a question from Mr. McMurray, he's been waiting for a while, and then I will take yours and then we're gonna move on. Mr. McMurray, did you have a question?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
All right. I'm concerned about the parking minimums being removed. Because in Chosen Park, we have a situation where 100-unit apartment building was approved with only 55 spaces of parking and no alternatives. The problem is that the city and the Beltline area are taking credit that they're actually producing walkable infrastructure. But there is no walkable infrastructure, just a 40-year-old bus terminal. I mean, a bus, and that's just not sufficient. We're going to have people parking all over the community.
Yes.
And your presentation on the parking did not address that.
So
Secondly,
I'm gonna cut you off and answer that out of respect for you. So that's a content question, but Mr. McMurray, if you're listening, which I hope you are, again, this is a 85% draft. We know that a lot will change. What we have done with regard to any of the neighborhoods in the Beltline overlay, which Chosewood Park is, there is no parking requirement there today. We have incorporated that verbatim into the code. That was a relatively recent change on behalf of City Council. So I think it's safe to assume that the policy direction of the city has not changed. But by all means, if you have comments on that, or any particular neighborhood has comments on that very detailed parking map, use the website, use the email to let us know. So, and with that said, I'm going to use this as a reminder. Please, please, please attend the follow-up meeting on January 13th, which is going to be completely via Zoom. If you do have any questions or comments or concerns, you can send them to us at the project website. I'll have the email in a moment. But what we're gonna try to do is answer as many of those proactively. So if we see a lot of people are on the website asking, hey, what does this mean? Or this is a problem, or why are you doing this? We're gonna proactively answer them so that we can have some exhibits prepared. We do have a follow-up meeting then again on February 2nd, February 3rd, which is module 3, and then a Q&A. And if we need to have additional focus meetings, we're certainly available to do that as needed. To get in touch with us, again, this is really important part. Go to the project website www.atlzoning.com. Here you will find the slide deck for this evening, which is already uploaded. For those of you who are online, the boards that we have in the reception hall this evening are also available to review. But more importantly, at the top right, you'll see a button that says review the zoning drafts. If you click on that, there's a brief tutorial, and then you can click on it and you can read chapters 3, chapters 8, and chapter 10. In addition, and I'm really excited about this, again, I'm a zoning wonk. There are 3 maps, and one of our GIS people has graciously created a way for you to click on those maps, then click a button at the top that says here, and it will take you to a website where you can scroll around the map, you can find your house, you can see what parking zone you're in, you can see if the street down the road is designated a storefront street, you can see if what the sidewalk requirement is on your street. And very importantly, you can comment on it. So if the residents in Chosewood Park are unanimous in not wanting the requirements of the current Beltline overlay to apply, there's an opportunity to go into that map, to zoom in on Chosewood Park and leave as many comments on there as you want. Again, we're going to take this into consideration. This is a very important process, and what this does, right, is we are not hiding anyone's comments. Since day one, Director Holmes, Christy, and myself have been very, very transparent about letting every single person in Atlanta see what people are seeing. So you can go to that Convio site today. You can see every single comment received to date and who made it. You will be able to see that in the future. We're not taking private meetings on this. We're doing everything through the website or in a public forum because we want to be transparent. And we, again, want you to trust in the process that we've put together. So what we're going to do this evening now, how much time do we have remaining for the in-person? So we have about 45 minutes until the church kicks us out. If you would like, you can go out into the foreroom, look at the boards, let us know if you have any questions. Myself, Christy, and Director Holmes will be there to chat. For those of you who are online, both Christopher and Yinko will be giving you directions on how to access the website, where to find the materials. And again, take a look at them, ask a question. You can do it on there, you can do it via email. We really, really, really want to hear from you. And we want to hear from you both if you oppose something, but also if you support something. I will say from the last round, almost all the comments were only on people who opposed certain provisions of the code. So if you like something, again, let's be positive. Let's think about the consultant team's mental health and let us know if there are things that you think we're doing right as well, because that matters to the city and us just as much. Oh yes, one more process question, ma'am.
It might actually be really relevant as well. So R5 is where I live. I live in R5C. How will you translate the
C?
The C, yes.
Okay, yeah, this is
conditional. How will you translate those? Because it doesn't seem to be spelled out anywhere.
yes, good question. So if you've ever looked at the zoning map today, you'll see that properties have their zoning district, and then some of them have a -C at the end. The -C means that there are negotiated conditions that were negotiated with the neighborhood that the city council made as a condition of that approval. So here's how we're handling it. We looked at 9,000 zoning applications going back to the 1970s. We have culled the ones that don't apply. For example, Midtown, I'll pick on Midtown. Midtown had dozens of conditional zones that all went away when SPI 16 was created. So what we're doing is we are carrying forward all zoning conditions adopted after 2000. So 24 years ago. Most of the ones before those are either built out or they've been rezoned. That's a starting point for discussion. If we hear that there's a certain neighborhood and they want one from 1967 carried forth, let us know, we'll look into it. But are you in Edgewood?
Yes.
Yes. Edgewood recently proactively made some zoning condition amendments to the R5. Those are all going to carry forward.
So, but where do we see it?
You're not going to see it until the zoning map is produced as module 3. There will be the next meeting. We are going to have an interactive zoning map so you can see how everything translates. And any of those zoning conditions that are going to carry forward will carry forward. For those of you who want to know today, it's really easy. If you go to the City of Atlanta GIS website, go to what is called Planning Viewer. There's a way you can look at your zoning. Click on it, and you will see what is called a Z number associated with that, like Z00-251. If that Z number is 00 up to 24, that means it is a post 2000 or later condition, and it will be carried forward. If you go in there and you see that it is Z67-125, that's not carrying forward. So that's the way we're doing it initially. And the other thing I will add is we're still in the process of figuring out how do we convert the PDs. I know Councilwoman Norwood, you have a lot of PDs in your MPU, and I know MPUs A, B, and C have a lot as well. We're going to carry forward all those conditions, and we're still in the process of figuring out how do we handle the PDH because it is a little bit different. And we don't want to open up the door to inadvertently suddenly throwing out all the negotiations that you went through. And so if you're in a neighborhood that has what are called PD districts, the conditions are going to carry forward, and we're going to assign them the most closely applicable zoning district. Mr. Copeland?
Processing question, I think.
Okay.
We have Fulton County tax records that have certain information when someone looks up a piece of property. Is anything being done or thought to coordinate our changes with City of Atlanta properties in Fulton County? Okay, because sometimes people don't always use our zoning orders, they look up the tax records. And it's possible the properties on C3 may not be C3. So just a suggestion, is there a way, may not be a way, but is there a way to correlate that? Or is that been?
So Mr. Copeland's comment is really important for every single person in this room and on this call. Today, if you own property and you go to the county records and you look at your tax record, there is a zoning number on there that means nothing. Pretend it doesn't exist. The county does not regulate zoning in the city of Atlanta. The city of Atlanta regulates zoning in the city of Atlanta. The county records are probably 98% wrong in that regard. The question was, can we work with Fulton County once this code is adopted to update that? I'm going to turn that over to the city and say we'll see what we can do. We all know how that can go. So thank you, Mr. Copeland.
Note that somewhere in our zoning orders, put a caveat that difference occurs. In other words, trust me, people who buy property want to see what the tax records are.
Yeah.
And they look up and see some kind of zoning district and erroneously comprehend that to be the Atlanta ordinance. So maybe somewhere in our application stuff, we caution folks, be careful about what you read, that there is a distinction between the two different governments. And I can see that.
No, I think that's a great point. The comment was, can we, this is module 3, can we think about ways to convey that to the public, either in the code or more appropriately, probably in the mapping process, like make that clear. Great point. All right, well, that concludes my presentation. Again, thank you so much, and we look forward to your comments. I want to see everyone in January.
Okay.